Hello, welcome to another edition of AP World History at University High School. We're in chapter 32 here of the Earth and its Peoples, and we're looking at a specific topic of the growth of Asian economies in the second half of the 20th century. Okay. And then a couple of other topics as well. So check out these headlines. The real leap forward. China joins the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 1999, which, by the way, look at the WTO, World Trade Organization. That didn't exist before World War II. The UN didn't exist before World War II. These international type of organizations didn't exist before World War II, so an important trend you're going to need to notice after World War II in the second half of the 20th century is a greater amount of global organizations and cooperation and globalization and an interconnectedness. Okay, China's contradictory socialism. Why? Because that's kind of capitalistic, right? China welcomes business into the party. China's boom means a growing consumer class. All these headlines, they all suggest Chinese economic growth and capitalism. A dragon stirs. China's biggest bank goes public, meaning that individuals can buy stock in that company. Well, that sounds very capitalistic as well. Walmart eyes China expansion. China definitely exists Walmart exists in China. China's hot pace unlikely to cool. Undone by China. China reports near record trade surplus in September. Okay, what's my point? So it's all about China, China, China. But that wasn't really until like the late 70s, early 80s actually. That's when the changes began in China. And really the explosive economic growth didn't start coming until like the late 80s, early 90s. But after World War II, it was about another East Asian place, and that's where we're going to start. So you've got some questions as well on your on there that you may answer if you like, but you've got to be taking notes here as well. So before we get into those questions, beginning with document 1, let's talk about the first major East Asian economy that was also industrialized, right? And that's Japan. They experienced their Meiji Restoration and a process of industrialization in the late 19th century. But after World War II, they were devastated, just totally destroyed as well. However, there were U.S. financial, there were loans made to Japan. There were like probably financial grants as well to help rebuild the country. And what you're looking at here is gross domestic product, or basically the wealth, the growth rate in Japan. So a healthy growth rate is usually somewhere, if it's a big economy, if it's a large economy, anywhere from like around 3% is pretty healthy, 3 or 4, if it's a big economy. Japan's growth rate beginning in the 50s is close to 8, shoots up to over 12%, and hovers around 10% throughout the 50s, 60s. And then in 1972, this was a global oil crisis. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they really disrupted their supply of oil. That's partially because there was a war between Israel and Arab nations, and that was the OPEC retaliation, was to place an oil embargo on many countries around the world. So that's what explains that over there. But anyway, the rate of growth is really high for Japan, and then in the 80s it's still pretty high, and you can see it drops down in the 90s. So this is where it's been in the 90s, in a lull, pretty low. But this is what we're going to focus on. How did they do this? Whoops, didn't mean to click on that. They created economic alliances called Keiretsu, excuse me, not to be confused with Zaibatsu during the Meiji period. These were like, again, economic alliances. I don't know exactly how they work, kind of like conglomerates that were not unlike those, those Zaibatsu were actually broken up, but these new alliances appeared. They included banks, various industries, commerce, construction. They were all tied together. Many other Asian nations actually followed this Japanese model. And what kind of things was Japan producing? First of all, most of the reason for this growth here is exports. You want to have a lot of exports. Every country does. And Japan had a ton of exports. And what they were producing in the 60s and 70s especially was cars, and pretty fuel-efficient cars compared to what was being produced in the United States, these giant boats basically. So it's the auto industry for export and advanced consumer electronics, That's what drove this massive economic growth. So the reason this is significant is because Japan is not a super big country, and yet today it has the third largest economy in the world. Up until 2010, it had the second largest economy in the world. It was all Japan. So what you see here, look at the per capita income as a percentage of U.S. income. So in 1955, Japanese people were making 10% of what American people were making. But the 50s was a period of big boom in the United States. But look at this. By 1990, they're making more than Americans. Per capita income is higher. In 1995, it's even higher still. But then like this housing bubble and stock market bubble where housing prices and stock values were overpriced in Japan, it burst. And that's why the yen, this is their currency, has been less valuable to the US dollar since. Okay. But this is like the Japanese miracle, if you will, that capitalism works. Okay, let's look at document 1 and see what kind of trends we see in this bar graph. So approximately what year did China hold the greatest percentage of world GDP? And it's around 1820, 1830. But then the Opium Wars happened, right? And then Western imperialism threw out there. And then they don't industrialize. And they're ethnocentric and xenophobic and all that stuff. But look at the change after Deng Xiaoping and the explosion that China's experienced. Today it's 12% of the world economy. The United States 22%. And I'm sure this is going to widen some more, actually. So it looks like there's growth in India and in China, and that's what you need to be paying attention to, well, as adults in your life. What does this show you in document 2? Let's zoom in on China. It asks, during what 3 turbulent periods did China's economy appear to stagnate? That is, it was kind of stuck, right? And the 3 turbulent periods we see on here are the Korean War, the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution. These are command economy policies of top-down planning from the Soviet Union, or excuse me, from the Chinese Communist Party. But what changes occurred in China that allowed for this rapid economic growth in the graph? And there you go, market-based economic reforms. 1978, that's Deng Xiaoping, right? And it's after that it starts to grow gradually, and since the 90s, it's just been exploding. And this is an SEZ. So farms are privatized, first of all, right? The communes are ended. SEZ, what's that? That's a special economic zone that the government established in China that encouraged foreign investment into that zone or city. Factories sprung up there, foreign companies put production facilities there, and that is what explains for a lot of China's growth is foreign investment and farm privatization, and opening itself up to the world market economy since 1978. Let's look at document 3 here. Number 8 asks, first of all, it shows you China and Japan, which we already just mentioned, and then these 2 countries, South Korea and Taiwan. South Korea and Taiwan are 2 of the 4 so-called Asian tigers. Each of these nations experienced growth only after going through turbulent political or social upheavals, including wars. So explain those difficulties that preceded this economic growth in each nation. So look at this. This is year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. But the starting year is different for each of these nations. So for the red one, for China, the starting year is actually 1978. So for the red one, this is 1978. For the gold one, this is 1950. Does that make sense? See, 1950. So what happened in China before 1978? Well, Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, all sorts of muckiness that stagnated economic growth. And it's after 1978 that we see this growth. What happened in Japan before 1950? World War II, right? Which ended in 1945 and the dropping of the atomic bomb, and it was after that it sees this economic growth. For the Korean War ended in 1953. Then they went through like a dictatorship and some hard times, but then South Korea after 1962, growth. I don't know what you put for Taiwan though. According to the graph, only one of the nations appears to be experiencing growth still. That's not true, actually. Which nation and why do you think the other nations are no longer seeing growth? That's not true. They're all seeing economic growth still. Anyway, let's move on. So I mentioned Asian tigers. The Asian tigers, you need to know these 4 countries. So we've got the Japanese superpower, like this big economic power juggernaut, right? That is not one of the Asian tigers. The Asian tigers refers to these 4 smaller countries that based a lot on the Japanese model, see massive economic growth beginning in the late 1970s. So here's where the world is, this little dotted line, that's the world average, and all of these countries are below the world average in 1960. But look where they get to, some earlier, some later. We're talking about Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea. Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, Korea. Hong Kong today is actually part of China, but that wasn't until 1999. So during this whole thing, they're still part of Great Britain. So what explains this? Foreign investment in a big way, and they began to focus on the manufacture of small electronics components. That's true of Hong Kong and Taiwan. But Singapore is going to be a major banking center. It's really going to create a banking industry and encourage foreign banks to come in and operate there, and it is a big banking hub. Korea, also electronics and auto manufacturing, and they invest heavily in science and technology. So this is Taiwan and other selected nations, their annual output in science, and we're talking about scholarly papers on the y-axis. So Taiwan, lots of scholarly papers. Singapore as well. So that must mean that there's a lot of scientific activity happening there. Thailand and Malaysia, I'm going to confuse you a little further, they're the little like baby Asian tiger cubs, because Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea, they're already like industrialized now. And now there's a new set, brand new today, of new upstarts, and that's Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, and we'll look at some more in a second here. So check out Singapore today. It didn't look like this before the 1960s, and what created this again was, for them, it was their banking industry. Economic development was based on their busy port, because it's a city-state, one really busy port, and then banking and commercial services. Singapore also began to invest heavily in textile and electronics industries. Seoul, South Korea, they have today a very thriving auto industry, advanced electronics, cell phones, and things like that. Hong Kong, they started off with textile and consumer electronics industries as well, but they are also a busy port, so that contributed to their growth. It's a port city, and also banking. So Hong Kong is a big banking center in East Asia as well. It became reintegrated into the PRC, the People's Republic of China, actually in 1997. Taipei, Taiwan, an independent country also. They make a lot of small electronics components were made in Taiwan. So what you see here is between 1960 and 1985, countries ranked by growth in GDP per capita, and here you've got the 4 Asian tigers. They are 4 of the top 5 fastest growing economies on the planet during that period. I mean, their starting point was pretty low, and that's probably why Botswana, which is in southern Africa, is on here, because their starting point was probably really low. But they did see economic growth. Shares of world trade in 1965, you can see the United States is big in 1980, 1995 as well. But Japan's, you can see how much it grows. And look at the Asian developing countries. That's what we're focusing on. It's a pretty big slice, even bigger, and now it's even huge. So these are the Asian tigers: Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. These are small. These are just cities. They're not small cities, very big cities, but they're cities. And now we've got the Asian tiger cub economies that are currently growing pretty rapidly, and that's the large country of Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world, the Philippines, Malaysia over here, and Thailand. So these economies follow the 4 Asian tigers that have already become fully industrialized. So the Asian tigers are industrialized economies. There's something called NIE, Newly Industrialized Economies. NIE, Newly Industrialized Economies. Okay, let's move on to document 4, and I love looking at this one especially because this shows you economic growth for some of the biggest economic growth nations since 1990. So which country sees the largest economic growth since 1990? Duh, right? It's China. So let's look mainly at the yellow. Forget the blue because I don't know why they even split it between 2 there. But from 1990 to 2006, China sees 330% economic growth. That is massive. The U.S. growth seems kind of smallish, 60% growth, but it's not if you think about it, because it's already the largest economy in the world. So a big economy can't grow at as a rapid pace as smaller economies. So do we see the Asian tigers on here? Yep, there's Korea, there's Singapore, there's Taiwan, and Hong Kong is, oh, Hong Kong's on here as well. But here, the ones to pay attention to probably in the future now, in the 20th century, and this is chapter 33, are BRIC, B-R-I-C, write that down. BRIC, Brazil, which sees modest economic growth, and it's growing it's been growing a lot more since 2006. Russia, which is not even on here. India, very substantial economic growth since 1990, and is still growing now. And China, of course, BRIC, B-R-I-C. Let's look at just some other fun ones. Ireland. Do you see how this is the second largest growth on this whole thing? That's mainly because Ireland was dirt poor before 1990, and what they invested in actually was internet technologies. The internet has actually been the biggest growth of the biggest engine for growth in the Irish economy, and they've also had like a big internet bubble that kind of burst recently, and they've been stagnating economically, but that's what explains what happened in Ireland there. Cool, let's move on. Anything interesting about document 5 or document 4? Let's see, let's just for now. Let's look at document 5. This one's really cool because this is very relevant to chapters 32 and 33, and this is the world kind of today. It's gross domestic product, meaning the wealth basically around the world. So for and this is per square kilometer, so it's a very interesting piece of information here. So, which regions, either countries or cities or AP World History regions, appear to be the wealthiest? And it should pop out at you. It is the West, first of all, Western Europe and the United States. Those are the wealthiest. Excuse me, the wealthiest. And then you've also got, of course, Japan. Look at Korea. Look at Taiwan. Look at Singapore, and now growing a lot more, China. And growing a lot more, India, right? Number 14, what parts of Latin America appear to have significant concentrations of wealth, and why? Why do you think that's happening? And it's down here by the coast. A lot of this is a result of mining operations is the wealth in Latin America, but also increasingly they're just becoming more industrialized as well. Africa. Which parts are wealthiest in Africa? And it's kind of down here, and that's historically South Africa. That was gold and diamond mining operations. The British had settled there, established banks as well, and it's much more developed compared to the rest of the continent. And then, of course, Egypt, you see the Nile River right there, right? Middle East, though, that one's interesting. Which parts of the Middle East appear to have significant concentration of the wealth? Turkey, because of its connections to Europe, probably, but then also around here, and this is a lot of oil wealth, right? OPEC. Moscow is the richest city in the world, or rather the most expensive city to live in the world. Compare the wealth there in the former Soviet republics. These are the former Soviet republics over here. Compared to the wealth in, say, Western Europe or South Korea or Japan, is it as wealthy? That is not. Part of that is probably because of the policies of the Soviet Union, of communism. And you can see the differences between capitalism, you could say, and the remnants of communism. Let's move on to document 6, and this one is probably my funnest one. It's really hard to read, but this is 1970 over here, and this is 2000 over here. These are projections, actually. No, I'm sorry, this is 2050. So the USA, 1970, was the largest economy in the world. Japan was second. Germany was third. Do you find it interesting that these were the two major aggressors in World War II, and they were totally destroyed, and yet, with the help of the United States, they became the second and third largest economies within 30 years, 20 years. The UK was fourth, France, Italy, Russia, Brazil, India, China. So we have all of BRIC on here. These were 10 of the largest economies in the world in 1970. But what does this thing from this magazine project will happen by 2050? The USA will still have a very large economy, the second largest in the world, but what will be the biggest economy in the world sometime in your lifetime? China. Third, India. Fourth, Japan. They're still going to be hanging in there according to this projection, but look at BRIC making a push. Brazil. And Russia. So we've got BRIC basically in there, along with Japan and the United States. So that's it for our notes. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you learned something.